Volume up? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me? I have a pretty loud voice anyway. I'm Dr. McMahon, professor of history at Gateway College. I appreciate everyone who is here today, and I want to give a shout out to everybody who's watching on the live stream or maybe after the fact on our YouTube channel. We are living in unprecedented times with a military attack going on in Europe, the first fighting we've had on that continent since 1945. That's before I was born, so that was a long time ago. My first reaction when I heard about this incidents in Ukraine and in Russia was it's an opportunity to learn more about it, because who's affected by the high gas prices? Who's affected by cost of things going up? Who's affected by hearing about if gas goes up, everything goes up? How is it all connected? What's it all about? It can be very confusing. So fortunately, we have someone who is from that part of the world. Dr. Pavel Murdzhev is from Bulgaria. He has a PhD in European history from University of Florida, go Gators, and he teaches classes in European history and military history. He teaches for us. Dr. Murdzhev teaches for Santa Fe, and he also teaches for the American Military University. He's got a presentation on Ukraine and the situation, and then I hope we have some questions and answers. I'm going to dash around with this microphone, and you'll be able to get your questions in. Even if you're in the back, we'll get you a question. So let's give a warm round of welcome to Dr. Murdzhev. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for the honor of hearing me with a short history of Ukraine, as Dr. Sean introduced me. I'm from Bulgaria, which is pretty close to the conflict in Ukraine. This camera and the video probably is not going to be shown to Putin, right? Few things about Ukraine. You know, today, you know, both Ukrainians and Russians have their own story about the past. And one of the main points for the conflict in Ukraine is about the statement of Putin of how fake country is Ukraine, and claiming that history of Ukraine is actually history of Russia. So allow me here a few slides and a few words about history of Ukraine from the 9th century to nowadays. So like all origin stories, you know, both are a mixture of historical facts and political imagination, that of Russian version and that of a Ukrainian version. I just placed here a picture of a monument of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the Central Square in Kiev, as well as the St. Sophia Cathedral of Kiev. St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev is made in 9th century by the Kievan Rus leaders or rulers. Bogdan Khmelnytsky is a figure of Cossacks independence that is closely associated with Ukrainian search for a national identity. So, a few things at the beginning. Well, in 19th century, in 1882, Kiev was conquered from the Khazars by the Viking noble Oleg, the son of Rurik. His people who started the long period of rule of the Rurikid princes. In the 11th century, Kievan Rus was geographically the largest state in Europe, becoming known in the rest of Europe in its Latinized name, Ruthenia. That means from Rus and Ruth. Historically, the various western and southern provinces, what is now called Ukraine, were populated by Slavic people that later were called, viewed as those that living on the border. Ukraine means, it comes up from the word Kraina, which means a border zone. Subsequently, people who lived in the border zone are Ukrainians, those who live there. However, most of the time they identify themselves like Russians. In other words, those of Rus. The greatest period of Kievan Rus started during the reign of Vladimir the Great, who married a Byzantine princess in the late 10th century, early 11th century, Vladimir the Great was an ally of the Byzantine emperor. He married the sister of the Byzantine emperor, and under the condition, of course, to convert to Christianity. The greatest extension of Kievan Rus came up at the time of his son, Yaroslav the Wise. And I just place here a little picture of a chronicle of Radziwill Chronicle, the old East Slavic chronicle that shows the depiction of Russian or Rus soldiers at the walls of Constantinople. The principalities of the later Kievan Rus, after the death of Yaroslav the Wise in 1054, disintegrated in many principalities. To the northwest, you can see here the independent city of Novgorod. It's marked in gray. Independent city of Novgorod was an oligarchic republic, free of monarchical authorities. To the northeast, there was the principality of Vladimir Suzdal. That was the principality that later will be centered on Moscow, and Moscow will claim up, the principality of Moscow will claim up the Ukrainian lands. To the southwest, the principality of Halych grew into kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia. Under the impact of Mongols' invasion in the mid-14th century, Galicia-Volhynia ceased to exist. The state finally disintegrated under the pressure of Mongol invasion of Rus, fragmenting into successor principalities who paid tribute to the Golden Horde. They call it in Russian history and Ukrainian history, it's called the Tatar yoke. This tribute was actually enabling a lot of princes of these principalities to collect the tribute and to keep it for themselves. That's how they built up the military power to withdraw the Tatar yoke. The most eager ones was those of the Muscovite principality. Thus, in the late 15th century, the Muscovite Grand Dukes actually began taking over the former Kievan territories and to claim that they're the real descendants and the real successors of the Kievan Rus. One of the political moments that is announced from Moscow nowadays is that the Cossacks were actually Russian or Kievan or Ukrainian inhabitants. But who were the Cossacks? The Cossacks were, you know, in the contemporary literature, they are presented as a quite brutal, tough guys that participated in many military operations in both Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom and the Russian Empire, of course. Originally, the term referred to the semi-independent Tatar groups that are called Kazakhs, which means free men in the Mongol language. They inhabited the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea near the Dnieper River. By the end of the 15th century, the term was also applied to the peasants who had fled from the devastated regions of the Dnieper and Don rivers and inhabited the so-called wild fields. You can see it on the map here. The wild fields are those marked in yellow. The southern frontier region of modern Ukraine that was buffering the Poland-Lithuanian kingdom from the Crimean Khanate. Until at least the late 1630s, these Cossacks groups remained ethnically and religiously open to virtually anybody, although the Slavic element was predominant. I just wanted to show you how this yellow areas of the map, the so-called wild fields, coincide with the Putin's idea of Novorussia. It is pretty much the same territory. Therefore, the Cossacks here, from the Moscow viewpoint, are considered Russians. Let me go on the slideshow. guess that's a good introduction. So the Cossack structure, guys, arose partly in response to the struggle against the Tatar raids and partly against socioeconomic developments in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, where in the 16th century serfdom was reimposed because of the favorable conditions for grain sales in Western Europe. That means that because of the demographic boom in Western Europe, there was a greater demand of grain, and as a grain producer area, Polish and Lithuanian Kingdom was actually intensifying serfdom to secure labor force for this grain production. You can see here Victoria Zaporozhian Cossack. Zaporozhye is a small portion of these wild fields, yellow marked on the map, with the head a Tatar. It's a print of 18th century. To the attempts of the Polish-Lithuanian kings to impose feudal dependency on these territories, the Cossacks responded with frequent revolts. There are quite many revolts, starting with that of Krzysztof Kosinski in 1591, 1593, and a lot of names that are marked in the ending with Karpovskidian revolt in 1638. Cossacks actually fought against Muscovite Russia as well. In 1604, Zaporozhian Cossacks fought on the side of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth against the Moscow army, and in 1709, Ivan Mazepa, one of the hetmans, one of the rulers of the semi-autonomous area of the Cossacks, sided with the Swedish against the army of Peter I, one of the founders of modern Russia. The Cossacks became particularly strong, in the first quarter of the 17th century under the leadership of the hetman Petro Konashevich Shaidanachy, who launched successful campaigns against the Tatars and the Turks. When we're mentioning the Turks, we have to be aware that the Cossacks were one of the greatest buffer powers between Lithuanian Kingdom as well as Russian Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. And I just placed here a very important, very popular painting of Ilya Repin entitled Cossacks Write a Letter to a Turkish Sultan. To the response, actually, to the demand of the Turkish Sultan to acknowledge his power and to subdue to the Ottoman power, you can imagine from the painting that they were not quite agree. There is a quite interesting response that you can find, and it's not quite suitable to be, presented to such a nice audience here. As a result of the mid-17th century Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising, however, the Cossacks briefly established independent state, which later became autonomous Cossacks Hetmanate. Hetmanate is coming up from the word hetman, which is something between a ruler and a captain. It lasted more than 100 years, and it gradually lost its autonomous status, but it was placed under the suzerainty of the Russian Tsars from 1667, but was ruled by Lopman hetmans for a century. Yet the principal political problem of the hetmans was defending the autonomy of the hetmanate from Russian centralism. And one of the most important hetmans that are part of this period of Cossacks' independence was that of Ivan Vyhovsky, Petro Doroshenko, and Ivan Mazepa. The latter is explicitly controversial figure because it's accepted from the Russian historiography as a quite anti-Russian and anti-Slavic ruler. Ivan Mazepa actually sided with the Swedish on the Battle of Poltava in 1709 against the army of Peter the Great. Well, the Cossacks' relations with the Tsardom of Russia were always strange from the outset. At the times they supported Russian military operations, at other times they rebelled against them. by the 19th century, the Russian Empire had annexed the territory of the Cossack host or hetmanate, or sech, as they call it, and controlled them by providing privileges for their service, such as exemption from taxes, allowing them to own the land they farmed. And at this time, the Cossacks served as military forces in many wars conducted by the Russian Empire. This is a painting of Konstantin Makovsky to represent how a modern Cossack looked like in the 19th century. In the official view, however, dominant also in the Russian historiography, the Ukrainians were a subdivision of Russians, Little Russians, as they were called, torn from the unity of Rus by the Mongol Tatars and deflected from their proper historical course by the baneful influence of Poland. A few things about the modern Ukraine that appeared in the beginning of the 20th century. Ukrainian modern history as an independent state amounted to a few years of shaky Ukrainian People's Republic between the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 due to the October Revolution and the consolidation of the Soviet Union in 1920s. There were in about 3 years in which Ukrainian state was established. Ironically, its incorporation into the Soviet Union at 1920 was one of its original constituent republics, was an important milestone of the path to national sovereignty of Ukraine. The incorporation established territorial boundaries, recognized Ukrainians as the republic's tutor nationality, and for 7 years offered the republic's communist leaders a substantial degree of autonomy, increasing over time in the internal government of their territory. There is a picture of a nationalist rally in Kiev in January 1917 when the national independence of Ukraine was declared. We must know, however, that the post-Soviet Ukraine was built a national identity around the memory of Holodomor or Goldomor, the famine, the intended famine inflicted in the early 30s by Stalin that took the life of more than 3.5 million people. It's seen by current Ukraine state, as some historians, as a punishment Stalin intentionally inflicted upon Ukrainians, and for many historians it's considered a genocide. In Putin's view of history, however, the modern Ukrainian independence movement began not in 1917, but during the World War II. Under the German occupation of Ukraine between 1941 and 1944, some Ukrainian independence fighters aligned themselves with the Nazis, whom they viewed as saviors from Soviet oppression. Putin has drawn this period in history to portray a Ukrainian push for sovereignty as a Nazi endeavor. He draws on Ukrainians' wartime collaboration with the Nazis to baselessly characterize the modern country as a Nazi nation. And the debate over how to remember Ukrainian World War II history, as well as its implication for Ukrainian nationalism and independence, is key to understanding the current conflict in Ukraine. Last, I just placed a map to see the integration of different territories in today's territory of Ukraine. To the initial Ukrainian territory of 1654, was added the territory of Russian Empire in the next century, the territory that was added by Vladimir Lenin. Actually, these wild fields were reinstated back to Ukraine. Joseph Stalin took the territories that were taken by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth after the World War II, and he added them to Ukraine. In 1954, Khrushchev, Ukrainian himself, he moved Crimean Peninsula from Russian Federation back to the territory of Ukraine. Well, that was a brief, summary of the history of Ukraine up to nowadays. Thank you.